Pandya, daughter of Indian immigrant parents in Canada, first fulfilled the quintessential Indian immigrant dream. She became a doctor with a specialization in neuroscience. Then she shifted her gaze to space and found her lifelong passion to become an astronaut, even while combining it with medicine. She has been chosen to be Canada's first female commercial astronaut from her perch as a physician with the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences IIAS. As the director of IIAS Space Medicine Group, Dr. Pandya was on the first crew to test a commercial spacesuit in zero gravity in 2015 and is the veteran of 12 parabolic flights, totaling over 180 parabolas to date. She is a two-time aquanaut with the NEPTUNE and NEP2NE missions and was a scientific lead on the first IIAS suborbital research flight. She is currently preparing for her space flight on board Virgin Galactica's Delta class flight, likely sometime in 2026. Shawna spoke to Mayank Chai Reports.
Welcome to Mayank Chai Reports, Dr. Shawna Pandya. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations. It's remarkable that you got chosen as the first, Canada's first female commercial astronaut. How did that come to be?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like the news is still sinking in. This is a product of the result of nearly a decade's worth of work with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. I have been a part of this organization and worked with it for 9 years now. And I have slowly risen through the ranks in my time at the institution. First creating the institution's first space medicine course. I'm the chief instructor, a course that goes on till this day. And I also stepped up to direct the Institute's Space Medicine Group as the director since 2020, 2021. And I was the medical and the scientific lead on our first suborbital research mission in November of last year, when we sent our first astronaut to space, Kelly Girardi, who will now be joining me as a crewmate on our second ever research mission. So really, this wasn't an overnight success. This was the product of years and years of hard work with amazing people who really had a vision.
You know, as someone of Indian extraction, I can understand that you are a doctor, but how did you come to combine space and medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I, like a lot of kids, grew up wanting to be an astronaut. I watched Canada's first female astronaut, Dr. Roberta Bondar, go to space as a child and thought, oh my gosh, we can do that. So that kind of gave me a blueprint for what I wanted to study. I thought, well, she's a neuro-ophthalmologist, a scientist, and a physician, and then an astronaut. So I thought, I'll go study neuroscience, be a physician, and then hopefully be an astronaut. And that really set the path for me. As early as high school, I knew that I was going to study neuroscience for my honors BSc degree and then apply to med school. And along the way, I remembered that the passion for space exploration was what drove all this. And so I actually applied for a master's program at the International Space University for their master's in space studies. I was lucky enough to be accepted to both the master's program and to medical school in the same year. And really, you know, after a lot of deliberation, realized that space and passion for space was what was driving all of this. So set off on a year's worth of study at ISU. And that was when I really realized that space and medicine combined form the field of space medicine, wherein we address the hazards of the spaceflight environment, from gravity, from reduced or increased gravity fields to isolation and confinement to increased radiation, to keep humans happy and healthy and not just surviving but thriving in space. And as part of that master's program, I was lucky enough to do an internship at the European Astronaut Center supporting the Crew Medical Support Office. And my master's thesis work there was very instrumental in helping define the hazards to a new delivery vehicle to the International Space Station at that time. And that's when I really realized that people do this for a career.
Right.
And really was committed to making space medicine a part of my own career.
You know, it's a great segue for me. I was reading up a bit on bioastronautics, astronautics, sorry. It's something that you would be concerning yourself with. In that context, I also read one of your comments where you talk about astronauts having the potential problem of pre-developing, becoming pre-diabetic, and glucose monitoring is something that you would be perhaps concerned with. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we know from longer duration spaceflight and orbital missions, that is, missions that orbit the Earth continuously, is that even astronauts who are typically the healthiest of the healthy, they're very rigorously medically screened at the space agency level if they were to go through a NASA or Canadian Space Agency astronaut selection. They tend to develop signs of insulin resistance and pre diabetic changes over the course of an orbital space mission, but we don't know how quickly those changes occur. And so the science that I led on our double IAS 01 research flight aboard Virgin Galactic was the first time in the world that a continuous glucose monitor had been sent to space and suborbital flight. And really the question we want to ask is, can we observe glucose changes in as short a flight profile as suborbital flight? And the reason that's important because it will give us indications as to how quickly glucose resistance can develop. It will also proving the efficacy and the safety of a continuous glucose monitor in changing gravitational fields, including the increased G loads of launch and landing, will also demonstrate the efficacy for anyone who has a glucose monitor, proving that should not be a disqualifying factor for spaceflight. And finally, studying normal physiology in an extreme circumstance, such as a spaceflight environment, can further give us insights into how diabetic changes act in normal 1G conditions, say on Earth.
We are not too far from really long duration flight, say, for instance, to Mars at some point in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, perhaps, which we're talking about between 6 to 9 months one way. How do you, as somebody who's going to work in space medicine, what immediate challenges do you think you would flag for missions coming up? You talked about decreased gravity or even zero gravity. Now, people don't realize the profound impact of gravity on everything that we are. I would be
That's
very interested to know your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So when we talk about the challenges of what we call exploration class missions, so deep space missions to the moon, Mars, and beyond, we talk about the challenges of human health in space as the bridge framework. So R stands for increased radiation. So outside of the protective confines of the Van Allen belts within which even the International Space Station flies, most of the higher energy ionizing radiation at that level is still filtered out. And that radiation can come from galactic cosmic radiation, from solar particle events. So we don't have that protection at the level of the moon or Mars. So that's a consideration. There's the isolation and confinement aspect of it, and part of that includes resupply. So we don't have the same capabilities to resupply with, say, medical supplies that we do even aboard the International Space Station. And then tied to that is the distance from Earth. So if you're talking about a Mars mission, depending on the alignment of Earth and Mars, you can expect a 6 to 48 minute round trip communication delay, or even a 2 to 3 week blackout period if the sun is between the two planets, meaning that astronaut crews on the red planet have to be increasingly independent and autonomous when it comes to medical care. And then underscoring all of that is physiological changes in gravity, as you so correctly pointed out. So we know that from 60 plus years of human spaceflight data, that pretty much every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. Our bones lose density, our muscles lose mass, our fluids shift upward. That includes the fluids in our brains and spinal cords called the cerebrospinal fluid. It doesn't drain as normally as it would under 1G circumstances on Earth. Leading to pockets of increased pressure, including on the optic nerves at the back of our eyes as they exit into the brain, which in certain populations for longer duration spaceflight over 30 days can result in vision shifts. So that's considered a potential showstopper for Mars. And the list goes on. We know that immune system function is altered and even depressed in certain cases. And then there's all of the other environmental concerns of when we talk about the Ridge framework. So that's what the E stands for. That's everything from altered day-night cycles. So at the level of the International Space Station, you're experiencing one sunset or sunrise every 90 minutes. So 16 sunrise sunset cycles per 24-hour period. At the level of the moon, if you're at the equator, it's 14 days of day, 14 days of night. And then if you're on Mars, it's seemingly innocuous to start with. It's 24 hours, and 39 minutes. But that means every day you're gradually shifted such that 24 days later, you're essentially at the exact opposite of the time at which you started. So you're operating 12 hours asynchronously with Earth. Which can have impacts as well. So to summarize, when we talk about all of that, this Ridge framework, R is radiation, I is isolation and confinement, D is distance from Earth, G is altered gravity, and E is environment or everything else. And that even includes lunar dust or regolith, which we know from the Apollo missions was a very potent skin, ocular, and respiratory irritant.
The way you're describing it and the way one has read all this, one wonders why one wants to go to space at all, to Mars or the moon, because these are not friendly places by any yardstick. Space itself is almost like your adversary, right? It has nothing going for human life. Once you're out of the confines of your spacesuit or your spacecraft, you're basically done. Your lifespan is perhaps a few minutes if you're exposed. So why do you think this is feasible at all at this current juncture?
Absolutely. So when we talk about humans doing hard things, fundamentally, it's what it means to be human, to be curious, to explore. It's what caused us to set out new passages from Europe, for example. It's what led to the establishment of ongoing science activities in Antarctica today. And it leads to new discovery, whether it's in the microorganism world, whether it's in how material science develops. That's true on Earth, that's true in space. And then finally, the types of advantages we can derive from learning how to survive in very austere environments, gives us a survival advantage, as well as being able to bring these benefits back to our most in need environments on Earth. So for me personally, I am a physician, and a lot of my work is in medical technology development and bringing the best of what we've done in medical technology back to our most in need, rural, remote, resource limited areas back on Earth. So I work, for example, in virtual reality, mixed reality, and immersive technology development to make diagnostic imaging and healthcare education and training more accessible, both for astronauts in long duration space flight and also for rural and remote communities. So by going to hard, hostile, difficult, almost difficult to thrive in locales and proving that we can in fact thrive there, we're also bringing a lot of benefit and return back to Earth.
Right. Your own flight on Virgin Galactic's Delta class vehicle is sometime in 2026, I suppose. What kind of preparations are you involved in? Because you still have quite a bit of time, or you don't think it's a lot of time?
There is the list of preparation grows a little bit longer every single day. My crew is incredible. I am working with Kelly Girardi, who flew on our first galactic research mission, as well as Dr. Nora Patton, who will be Ireland's first astronaut. And the coordination in microgravity of how we carry out our science, making sure we all know what the other crewmate is doing to make sure that we're working in choreography to operate payloads that may require multiple operators, and then also making sure that we're deconflicting with any other researchers who may be in the cabin, and that we also have contingency plans. So we definitely, each of us have a lot of microgravity experience. I myself have 12 parabolic flights under my belt, 11 of which have been research flights. And so when we talk about parabolic flight, we talk about an airplane flying up and down in a parabola. And when you're falling at the same rate as the aircraft, you're in free fall and you get about 20 seconds of microgravity or zero G in which to practice your scientific maneuvers. So most recently, our team was at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa this past August, doing science in neuro-ophthalmology, women's health, and diagnostic imaging. So, if you asked us to choose payloads tomorrow, it would be a doable but tough mission because we have so many payloads on our shortlist, and we're hoping to perform and complete our down select over the next 12 months.
So when you do go to space in 2026, what kind of distance are we talking from Earth?
Yeah, we're talking about a suborbital mission. So previously we've been talking about previously we've been talking about orbital missions. So for example, aboard the International Space Station,
Right.
you launch and then you're continuously orbiting the Earth. When we talk about a suborbital mission, we talk about essentially going on a really, really, really high parabola and then reaching the apogee and then free falling for a longer period of time. So it's a same day mission. It means you have to be very, very rehearsed, very choreographed, very prepared to know exactly what you're going to do with the finite amount of time that you have in microgravity, and that performance is paramount, and that there's a lot of trust that goes into you as an operator and the bonds that you've developed as a team. And there's really a lot of pressure on it, and I often liken it to a championship level performance in athletics. That's what we saw with Kelly's flight in 2023. She just absolutely nailed it, and we're looking forward to replicating that success.
You spoke of 20 seconds at a time of microgravity experience. In those 20 seconds, what kind of experiments can you really perform? I'm curious to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the science that I've performed in the past has been everything from increasing the technology readiness levels of technologies that may someday make it to space, proving that they are hardy and capable and there's no interference or operational issues in zero gravity. So I've operated biomonitoring devices that can give us telemetry from what our vital signs are doing and how they may act in zero G as well as increased gravity. I've tested virtual reality medical suites and diagnostic point of care imaging, point of care ultrasound. More recently, we've performed pupillometry studies looking at the rate of constriction of our pupils in the zero G environment, because that is thought to be a surrogate marker of that increased intracranial pressure I was talking about earlier. And in fact, we've previously tested that in orbital flight on the Axiom 2 mission, as well as the upcoming Polaris Dawn mission. We've also pioneered some really novel studies in women's health. We most recently completed the first ever demonstration of an intrauterine device insertion in microgravity. And we also partnered with esteemed colleagues from the University of Southern Florida to look at the vaginal microbiome changes pre and post exposure to different gravity environments.
This is a lot. I mean, people don't realize the amount of detailing that goes into becoming an astronaut. Eventually, if you are looking at longer duration flights, tell me about your first experience when you took your first parabolic flight. Physically, how did you respond to it?
My first parabolic flight was a very, very different one from all of my research flights, because this was while I was still a medical student, prior to really becoming a full-fledged microgravity researcher. And what had happened was I was attending Singularity University at NASA Ames about 15 years ago, and it turned out that the Zero G Corporation was coming to NASA Ames and doing flights there. And being very young and early in my career, I thought, when will I ever have a chance to fly zero G again? And so this was a commercial flight. It wasn't a research flight. And it actually, due to flight delays, ended up taking place on my 25th birthday. So that was really a unique way to celebrate my birthday. And I actually flew with commercial astronaut Soyun Yi, a former shuttle astronaut, as well as an Australian researcher and engineer who is now Australia's first astronaut, Catherine Bennell-Pegg. So it's really interesting to see that the paths we carve out for ourselves and who we surround ourselves by, even early on in our careers, really does tend to be a predictor of how far we'll go. And that really paved the way. It was such an incredible experience. It was really a reinforcement that I wanted to do more of this with a science focus, and that really was a foreshadowing of all of the good things to come.
To change the gears a bit, we live in a privileged society in the US, in Canada, and generally in the West, where youngsters can have space dreams like you did and you accomplished it. There are so many millions, maybe a few, perhaps a couple of billion people you're talking about who have no access to even think about things like that. If there is, say, a girl in somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Asia who's dreaming of becoming a space or an astronaut at some point, what advice or what suggestions would you give them? Because I don't think they can even conceive of becoming one.
Absolutely. I want anyone out there who has that spaceflight dream to imagine that not even the sky is the limit, to believe that if you can dream it, you can do it. And at the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences, we really are proud of putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, because we are very international, very inclusive. To date, we've had over 400, maybe 500 participants from 60 plus countries, including Firsts of Nations. We have dedicated outreach groups to demographics that previously may not have had access to space, including women and minorities. We have our Space for All Nations group, and we also have our Out Astronaut group to catalyze access for those with the LGBTQ community. So this is a whole new ball game when it comes to democratizing access to space. This is the best possible time to be involved in human spaceflight and access to space. And I would encourage anyone with that dream to figure out what role it is you want to play in spaceflight, whether it's as a scientist, as an engineer, as a storyteller, and a science communicator, and then carve out that path for yourself. Make space for yourself, because there absolutely is space for you.
Do you see yourself as a long-term astronaut? I mean, is this going to be your career from now, or you think this is a one-off thing?
Absolutely. This has been something that I've been working very hard to create inroads in. My teammate Kelly has very famously said, we'll be the first, but we won't be the last. And we are catalyzing access to space in a way that hasn't been done before as commercial research astronauts. There's historically been the space agency route to space. Then there was the commercial route to space. And now we see subdivisions in commercial access to space, whether it's through tourism, through winning contests, through going as an employee, and then finally through our route as paving the way with research. So time will tell, but I don't think this will be a one-off.
Okay. What's your perspective on the growing idea that we will become a multiplanetary species at some point? I don't know about the timeline. I'm not even sure if it's feasible given the state of affairs on this planet, whether we would be welcome, we should be welcome elsewhere as a species, the way we are messing around with Earth.
Yeah, it's a very important question to ask. And in fact, I have an entire TEDx talk on it. And this kind of goes back to that earlier discussion we had about why explore. And, coming back to those points, of course, yes, it's a fundamental part of what it means to be human. Additionally, there is an economic advantage to venturing out into the stars, even if it's hanging out in low Earth orbit and telecommunications and geosynchronous Earth orbit, to have access to Earth observation, remote sensing, telecommunication satellites. That can be a catalyst to economic advancement. But going steps further and talking about becoming a permanent off-world multiplanetary ferrying species, that of course is a survival imperative. Right now we have 8 billion eggs in one fragile terrestrial basket. And the running joke within the space industry is that the dinosaurs didn't have a space program, and look where they are now. So of course, being a bit more nuanced about it, it's going to require a Herculean level of efforts in terms of collaboration, coordination, doing so in a very international and mindful fashion. We also have to be very ethical when it comes to planetary environmental protections and talking about non-contaminating any other environments, especially where those planets where we may even have hints of life. And finally, we also need to answer the question is, what does human reproduction look like in any gravity environment other than the 1G environment? And there's a lot of data and research from everything from zebrafish to jellyfish to salamanders to mice and rats. But we need to advance those studies because the data in a lot of cases is conflicting. And so we need to advance those studies to be very comprehensive, look at everything from gamete production to fertilization to in utero development to postnatal development, as well as challenges of labor and delivery off-world, and then slowly and ethically advance those studies to include primates as an analog for human reproduction. And again, ethics has to be a part of the conversation the entire way through.
And I'm glad you mentioned all those points because I'm in the midst of doing a book on gravity as we speak. It's been my lifelong fascination. I'm not a scientist, but my background is physics, so I understand broadly. I've been talking to a few scientist friends, and my point is everything that we are as a life form is a direct result of the kind of gravity that we have on this planet. We would be a very different species, even the next door moon. So if you're talking about Mars, it's something entirely different. Or say Europa, for instance, where the Europa Clipper mission is about to take off, I think next month. If gravity is such an important part, long-term colonizing of planets could be problematic in the sense that if you're going to create settlements where it's controlled gravity, you don't step out like we can step out on this planet, then it's fine. But otherwise, to develop as a different species, you need to be exposed to that particular environment, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of conflicting viewpoints on that. So even before that, we also have to consider the radiation environment. So outside of the Van Allen belts in Earth's surrounding Earth, we are exposed to 750-fold the amount of radiation we would be exposed to on one day on Earth at sea level. So now if you're living on Mars, you're accruing all of that extra radiation exposure. And then when we come back to the gravity question, the best way I've ever heard it put was by a former chief of medical operations at Johnson Space Center at NASA, Dr. Jim Logan. He said, we need to know the gravity prescription. What amount of gravity for what period of time for what exposures is needed to ensure adequate, safe, normal reproduction and development. And so is 17% on the moon, is that enough? If so, that's extremely reassuring for Mars, where it's 38% of Earth's gravity. If 17% isn't enough, we do need to know more. And there's new concepts in commercial space stations wherein artificial gravity, partial gravity rotating space stations, by virtue of the rate of rotation and the radius of the station, can create artificial partial gravity fields. So that may give us some insight closer to home before we ever venture out into these deep space locales. But we also need to figure out, is there any synergistic effects between altered gravity as well as increased radiation? And then we also need to be aware of any potential confounders that come from studies in partial gravity rotating space stations, because of we do experience effects from the height gradient. So taking a thought experiment, if you had a very, very short arm rotating space station, 1 meter in diameter, and you yourself are over 1 meter, then that gradient that you experience at your head versus toes is different, and that introduces a confounder. And then anytime you rotate your head from side to side, there's a cross-coupling effect as well as Coriolis effect. So it's a good analog. It's not a perfect analog, and we also need to be able to unthread or dissect what is due to partial gravity and what is due to the side effects of being in a rotating artificial gravity field.
No, this is extraordinary because I think a lot of people don't realize how lucky it has been for our species to be on this particular planet. Even things like the way we are able to speak or sing or dance or copulate, whatever, any activity is entirely a product of the gravity that we have here. It will not be the same anywhere else, most likely. Perhaps, as you said, Mars is about 30 odd percent of what we have here. So, unless we simulate or create artificial gravity almost equal to what we have here, we are thinking of becoming a completely, at least semi different species on even on the moon.
That's an excellent point, because even if we see one generation that is successfully developed, grown up, then the question is, well, what happens over multiple generations?
Right.
Are there micro evolutions, micro phenotypic changes that accrue, and suddenly we have a divergent species of humanity? That's the first question.
Absolutely.
And then the second question is, well, when bones evolve in a reduced gravity environment, maybe they'll evolve to be a lot more brittle, a lot less dense, meaning that there's actually hazards to returning to a 1G environment, and that they're more prone to breakage. So we definitely need a lot more data, and there's a lot of considerations when we talk
Right.
about becoming a permanent off-world multiplanetary species.
Just last couple of things. One, to finish this particular thought, say for instance, if you have a settlement on Mars, that is long term, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10, 20 years, those people can never come back to this planet if they have procreated, if they produce children there. The children will be basically Martians in a manner of speaking. I wonder if they can come back to a totally different gravity situation like Earth. How would you look at something like that?
Yeah, we to date, we don't know for sure whether they could or couldn't. I know in science fiction that it's been covered,
Right.
as early as Arthur C. Clarke, and saying, well, the children will grow taller in a reduced gravity field, but it also means that the way their balance evolves, their muscle mass, their bone density, all of that evolves will be not conducive to being able to survive in a 1G environment. So that's a very real consideration. But the truth is, we just don't know at this juncture. We do have studies from wasps and mice and termites, cockroaches, every manner of invertebrate, vertebrate, lower order mammal. But the jury is still out as to what the definitive answer is.
Okay. And finally, to come down to your personal background, I presume you're of Indian origin.
Yes, yeah.
Are you from both sides? Both your parents are from India?
Yeah, my parents were born and brought up in Mumbai.
Oh, I see. And I presume they are Gujaratis.
Yeah, yes, they are.
So am I. In terms of from your personal background, I mean, you of course know about Sunita Williams,
Yeah.
uh, who also has a Pandya connection
It's a
from.
great last name, yeah.
Yeah. So, what kind of cultural upbringing did you have in Canada as someone as your parents were from India?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a very blended cultural upbringing, in that my parents immigrated to Canada in the 80s, and they both wanted to bring their culture with them, but also make sure that, they embraced the Canadian culture. So in a very Canadian fashion, I took French immersion. I'm fluent in French as well, but
Oh,
we
really?
also, yeah, we celebrated Diwali, we celebrated Navratri, but we celebrated Christmas as well. And it was kind of the best of every world, because we just had every occasion to celebrate. And I think the thing that really drives me to this day is, there, of course, is that ambition that Indian parents and Gujarati parents have for their kids. But I think the thing that we don't talk about as often enough is both the work ethic that comes with growing up the way I was raised, especially as first generation. My parents were immigrants, and they worked so hard. And that level of work ethic for me was very normal and internalized. And then the second thing is the familial bonds, and knowing that you have a family that will go the extra mile for you, will walk through walls for you. And I think that's a level of privilege that has definitely helped get me to where I am today.